Once in 3rd grade they held Dewey Pepper's head inside a terrarium for 7 minutes, while Mr. Winters went out for a cigarette. The yellow snake hissed and slithered and looped itself around Dewey's neck as everyone sat silent and watched. When Mr. Winters came back, Linda Martins put up her hand and answered a question about the geography of the United States. Dewey didn't he put up his hand? Dewey never put up his hand. Dewey never talked except to Oliver, though no one ever heard them. Oliver was Dewey's only friend. By 4th grade they started on Oliver too. I saw it, pushing and slapping him in a circle, asking him, "What's Dewey sound like? I bet he says he loves you. Does he talk like a queer? Dewey didn't he have parents? He had grandparents. They were from somewhere else, and didn't he speak English?" In the spring they planted rows of tomatoes and gave Dewey sandwiches with horseradish that smelled across the cafeteria. Once in 5th grade, the other kids held Dewey down on a long plastic table and pressed the horseradish into his face. He didn't he say a word, he just took it. His eyes got real red, but he didn't he rub them, and he didn't cry. One of the teachers saw. In the teacher's lounge she said bows will be bows, and drank coffee. Dewey's grandparents didn't complain to the school board. They didn't speak English, and Dewey didn't have parents. Before that fall, no one ever took Dewey Pepper's picture. It wasn't like it is now, with all the news people around, pointing their black lenses and eating city lunches. Sometimes at recess the bolder ones climb fences and set off flashes, while the kids play footy on a cement. Goal after goal, and all they probably hope for is that it happens again. Those pale bloodless, young bodies. Dewey doesn't he play footy? Sometimes they put his picture in the paper all the same, with no story or caption, just a boy's picture. A boy by himself, standing. A boy just like any other boy except for the stitches across his mouth. But just watch as Dewey gets too close, and they scatter like frightened seagulls. Everyone's afraid of Dewey now. Not everyone scatters. If Oliver was alive, Oliver wouldn't he scatter? He'd write to Dewey in a secret notebook, and Dewey would write back, and they would stand beside each other at recess while the other kids played footy. In the newspaper they wrote under one of the pictures that Dewey can smile because of the stitches. But that's not true. Dewey can smile if he wants to. If Oliver was still alive, Dewey would want to smile sometimes if he read something nice or funny in the notebook. In the newspaper they also wrote that Dewey's grandparents aren't there anymore and that Dewey lives alone. That's a lie. 2. The tomato plants are still planted in the spring. Everyone knows Dewey's too young to plant tomatoes. During the trial when Dewey spoke they left a camera in the room, and no one else, because they were so scared. The judge and the lawyers and the jury and the rest of them. It was just one boy and a camera. They say you can see anything on the recording, just a black cloud, but I don't know if that's true. You can hear Dewey talk. They played part of it on the television. He must have taken off his stitches. It was Dewey's decision to put the stitches in. Most people don't realize that. He did it himself, but he carries a knife. 2. A little pocket knife that's just sharp enough to cut through the thread. He must have had it at the trial when they left him alone with the camera. He must have cut through and spoke. Dewey talked about how the boys took him to the bathroom, about how they punched him and held him down and called him names. Dewey's voice stopped sometimes. He said the blood tasted like horseradish. He said there were 5, but he didn't say their names. Johnny Nelson and Agustino were there for sure. I saw through the window. Nobody knows. But I saw them hit Dewey. I saw Dewey hit them back. The blood looked like tomato juice and Dewey said it tasted like horseradish. It was on his eye and around his lips. Johnny Nelson hit him hard and they all said bad things. Dewey fell and he didn't move anymore. But Johnny Nelson said bad things and Agustino was bleeding too. And he grabbed Dewey by the sweater and dragged him into one of the stalls. Johnny Nelson kicked Dewey in the head. Agustino spit blood. Then they picked Dewey up by the hair and they hit his face against the toilet. It was loud and Dewey's teeth were all on the floor. Dewey was bleeding. Dewey wasn't moving. Agustino was laughing and they left Dewey there. The window was open and I flew in when it was quiet. I landed on Dewey's soft brown air. I walked across Dewey's forehead and down his twitching eyelids. Blood was dripping from his nose, but I didn't try any. The breath from his nostrils pushed against my wings. His lips were moving and inside all the teeth were broken. There was a lot of blood in his mouth. It was open. I flew in and sat on his tongue. I pricked the flesh and took a drink. The blood tasted good. The tongue was warm. I called the others and they came. So many came in through the window like the darkest fog until the room was night. All were swarming and settling around Dewey's face, on the tongue, inside the ears, behind the eyes, up the nostrils and flying under the skull, around the brain, through the throat to the lungs and swimming down arteries to the very beating heart. Buzzing. We feasted, fed, we stayed. The ambulance siren wailed. You shouldn't have done it to Oliver, Dewey said on the tape. everyone was watching on television. They'd hanged Oliver on a coat hook. This was before Johnny Nelson and Agustino and the other boys. It was an accident. The school board said that Oliver couldn't breathe and he flailed his legs until he suffocated. The janitor found his body in the morning. Nobody asked why they didn't take him down. Nobody asked why they'd hanged him up. It was an accident, the school board said, and Oliver's mum cried loudest at the funeral. Months later, when Dewey came back to school, everyone left him alone. Even the teachers left him alone. His teeth were fixed, but all the new parts were a different color, and they looked jagged like a shark. Once in 7th grade, Dewey Pepper put up his hand. It was afternoon, and Mr. Winters was talking about the capitals of Asia. Linda Martins was there, and Donnie Nelson and Agustino and the others. Dewey Pepper put up his hand. Mr. Winters asked, "Yes," but when Dewey opened his mouth, instead of the sound of any word, it was "we" that came out. A trickle into a string, into a never-ending black buzzing ribbon that wound itself around every tender neck until not one more gas was heard. Suffocation and punctuation and frozen terror in their eyes. Outside, the 1st graders played on the grass. Across the hall, the 4th graders learned the basics of civil responsibility, and we filled throats and eyes and sucked out 7th grade blood until not a drop was left. Flattened, we returned to our host. When the bell rang, the classroom door stayed shut. Minutes passed. Dewey sat in his seat. Someone finally knocked. Finally, a teacher opened the door, and she saw, then they all saw, those pale bloodless young bodies. And Dewey, in the back row, alive and innocent, with a closed, quivering, peaceful mouth smiling. Now the news people are always around. Every day they eat lunches and wait, climbing fences and setting off flashes at footy games. Sometimes they take pictures of the beau standing alone with stitches across his mouth, the vampire boy, the butcher boy, the bloodletter. Dewey has no friends and doesn't smile, but no one teases him anymore and nobody says bad things. At lunch, he eats sandwiches with horseradish that smell across the cafeteria. He never puts up his hand and he never talks. When he gets too close, the news people scatter like seagulls. I found the 2-headed baby deer dying on a bed of soft pine needles under cover of an overturned oak not 5 kilometers from my cottage. Its lungs still pumped, and its crimson heart beat weakly through a thin, translucent skin that decayed before my eyes until there was no skin, and all the organs lay warm and still in a heap upon the earth like waste. A god evaporated. It is human nature to disbelieve that one may be witness to epical events, so I did not believe that I, of all people, should be witness to the death of time. Epical. The concept itself is dead. How lucky we were to know time at its cleanest and most linear. We know now that such constant linearity was the consequence of a living entity. It followed the creature like stench follows a skunk, and we basked in it as if it was the natural state of the world. No more. Time no longer heals. Things do not pass, or pass only to return. At first we believed this would be manageable. Yes, we thought, we will relive our pain but also our love. Everything shall be magnified. Welcome to an age of great emotions. A new romanticism. Yet we overestimated how much we helped. We failed to accept how much we hurt. And we did not realize the nature of evil, which accumulates in a way love does not. To re-experience our love is to know it again and again at the same intensity. But to re-experience pain is to increase its volume until it overpowers us, deafening us to everything else. I will never forget the creature's eyes, full of hatred or hubris yet seeking aid it knew I could not give. How does one save a dying god? It was not my fault. I was but a child asked suddenly to solve a deathbed equation expressed in an undiscovered mathematics. I had to fail, yet in failing I have brought it all upon us. I relive it constantly, every time its eyes are louder. But it is the hour for my afternoon walk, so I will take a pause and enjoy what remains of living. I will go to my favorite spot overlooking the city and sit on the iron bench. From where the view is magnificent, above me, the clouds will form a tangle of pain and human corpses, and I will sit and ponder until the first blood drops fall. Then the screaming will begin and the final storm will rage, beating crimson corpse clouds under a thin skin of dissipating reality, raining blood until we are left warm and still upon the earth. The foam began washing up on our shores 2 years ago. At first, it was sparse, resembled barely beaten egg whites, and most of us paid it scant attention because it posed no immediate threat. We relegated it to scientific interest. Over time, however, as it persisted, flowed and thickened into the consistency of properly steamed cappuccino froth, stories started appearing in the news, online, then on television. We traced its origins too deep within the Marianas Trench, but foam is boring, even as it subtly changes hue from ghostly white to green tea. Thus the first images of the foam most of us remember were mechanical, of urban clouds pushing it back into the sea. That worked, for a while, but the foam inevitably returned, subtly thicker, greener and more expansive the before. By the time the plows ceased their effectiveness, we had already identified the asteroid Isaac Asimov, but had not yet made a connection. The foam, albeit having covered much of our coastline, remained more of a nuisance than a threat, for it did nothing. As Earth worked to track the asteroid, then scrambled to destroy it, the foam crept silently inland. As you may be able to deduce, we were successful in neutralizing the asteroid. The world watched united as our international mission broke the asteroid apart and diverted its larger chunks safely away from our planet. We expected the atmosphere to deal with the resulting debris, to watch the pieces burn as they descended, but our expectations proved incorrect. Instead of a display of shooting stars, we witnessed a rain of cosmic dust. The atmosphere proved porous. Most grains fell upon the dry earth, but some landed in the now luminous green foam. Protected, they sprouted as seeds. Fertilized, they grew. There was an elegance to it. Ancient nutrients from deep within the earth and life from outer space. The resulting organisms, alien in the true sense of the word, were impervious to our weapons and excreted tiny spore-like particles as they matured. Within weeks, our skies were so polluted we could barely see the sun. We choked, and our immune systems reacted. We began foaming. Like our planet, our bodies betrayed us, and the particles took up residence in our moist and fertile viscera. They fed on us to breed. Once infected, an individual had only days left, but as a species we adapted, segregated and furiously engineered. I am one of the final survivors and personally witnessed the completion of the wormhole generator, via which I shall within the hour send this, my final communique, into an unknown past, or should I say your present. But I, too, am foaming now, and my fate has already been sealed. I am by nature a pessimist, but if my pessimism is misplaced, heed my warning, beware the foam. During funerals I often imagine I am a salt shaker. The salt shaker is empty and someone is shaking it, but, because it is empty, no salt falls out. There's a meal under the shaker, fried liver with onions, because no salt falls out. Because the shaker is empty, the meal tastes plain. The person eating is disappointed, he curses his luck and blames others. Sometimes he gets angry, sometimes the angry man is me. It's an impossibility that my therapist says is significant, but I pay my therapist. If I stop paying, she'd stop saying I am significant. I know it's an impossibility to be a salt shaker in the first place. I sleep well after funerals. The sleep is deep. Someone finally shakes me awake, but at least once I've been thought dead. It made my mother cry. When I came downstairs for breakfast, she didn't recognize me. I'm glad my mother is alive. She's the last of us, but she's in her 80s and will die soon. Too, at her funeral, I will imagine I'm a salt shaker, and afterward I will sleep long and well. In my physical life, I don't like salt. It is unhealthy and its taste overpowers. In your eyes, it stings. When I was a girl, salt was expensive even though we lived near a salt mine. The mine was famous and tourists came on buses. The buses were black and yellow like the mine workers. The tourists gave us candy. I much prefer sugar to salt. Sweetness compliments though. It, too, is unhealthy. Salt comes from the underground, which is close to hell. Sugar can be the product of bees, which are animals like humans, who are sinful, but can ascend to heaven. When I was a girl, I liked to lie on the grass and trace the paths of bees with my finger. If one landed on my stomach, I let it walk and tickle me all over. My mother lived with a man named Henry. Henry wasn't he my father, but that's what I called him, and when I did, my mother smiled and gave us both hugs. Henry died 11 years ago. He was a salesman and my mother loved him. For a long time I thought Henry was my real father. When I knew the truth, I told, and it made my mother cry and Henry mad. Henry called the police, and my mother hit herself until her fists turned red. I wasn't to sleep in my bedroom after that. The truth was that my real father worked in the salt mine. I don't know his name, but for one summer he came every night to visit me through a window. After the truth, my mother hit me, too, and the policeman asked me serious questions. One day Henry and the policeman drove in the police car to the salt mine. The road was dusty, and I saw the rising dust from my bedroom window even though I wasn't allowed there anymore. The newspaper wrote that my father didn't come out. It wrote that the manager of the mine let out all the workers, but my father stayed underground, and when the police went in with their pistols they found my father dead. I know because the newspaper has an archive. When I was older I went there. The mine closed. Soon after that, the buses stopped coming. There was no more candy. That was August. In November, I'm sent twice a week to a schoolmate's house overnight. My schoolmate's mother looks at me and tells me that I of all people should understand. Everyone treats me differently. I hate going there. Sometimes I run away home and sleep in Henry's storeroom. He stores tools and car parts and also blankets, with which I wrap myself to keep warm. The storeroom has two windows. One faces home, the other the forest. There's an old tree close to the second window, and when the wind picks up, the branches hit against the glass. The sound wakes me. Winter has come early. There's a storm. Through the window facing home, I see light in my mother and Henry's bedroom. Henry is on business. My mother must be worried. I don't like when she worries, so I hope the weather is not dangerous. I go to the second window, outside. The world is white, but I see three shapes. Two are standing. One is the policeman. Another is Henry. Henry is holding a pistol and his hand is shaking. There is a third shape under the pistol. The third shape is thin and on its knees and is chained to the trunk of the tree whose branches rattle against the storeroom window. The third shape is barely moving and I can tell if it is the shape or wind that howls. Henry puts the pistol close to the third shape's head and fires. I barely hear the sound but see the third shape stretch, then fall, limp, onto the fresh snow. The policeman pats Henry on the back and Henry gives the pistol to the policeman. They turn and I fall away from the window, scared. I shouldn't be here. I remember. I should be at my schoolmate's house. I wrap myself in Henry's blankets, but the blankets are cold and the cold makes the fear worse, and I suddenly imagine all of them standing in front of me, all four of them. Henry, my mother, the policeman and my father. They are silent but breathing, yet no steam comes out of their nostrils. Instead, they spew salt. The salt flows out of their ears and over their eyes, which turn pink, and from under their fingernails, which fall off. And the salt is bloody. It stings them and hurts them, and even before they fall apart like dolls, I know it is eating them from the inside like corrosion. I imagine that all the salt the miners ever took out of the mine is in their bodies, so that when it is done, and they are broken, all I see are thin shells filled with salt. But I also know that that is an impossibility, so they are people too, and they put each other back together. But now that I've seen their salt, I know they are nothing but painful containers. When the sun comes up, the body is gone. I wait until 9, then pretend I have returned from my schoolmate's house. My mother is nervous and Henry is not feeling well, so my mother suggests I spend the day outside playing. She helps me put on a coat and hat. The sun melts the snow and the ground turns softer. My shoes get muddy, so I play in the forest where the ground is harder and the snow persists. Between the roots of trees I find an injured bee. Maybe it was surprised by the snowstorm. I reach down to help it, at least to touch it and help it feel loved, but it stings me. I run home where my mother rubs cold alcohol on the swelling. She says that once a bee stings someone it dies. I don't know if that's true or just a fairy tale. I lived with my parents on a suburban street ending in a cul-de-sac. Our neighbor, Mr. Maxwell, was a widower who brought us home baked pies and helped my sister with her math homework. My high school crush, Natalia, lived in a brick bungalow 3 houses down. On Sundays we all went to church, and twice a month during the summer there was a street-wide BBQ. In the winters the kids went sledding on a nearby hill. Growing up, I considered it boring. Looking back, it was paradise. The Aberos moved in November. From the beginning it was obvious they were different. They didn't attend our church or make small talk by the community mailbox. Instead, they smiled and spoke about their own faith, atheism. Buddhist and Maya thought is connected, Mr. Aberoa once told me, because the Maya crossed the Pacific and colonized Asia. Although they were never aggressive in their proselytizing, it was their one topic of conversation, and we quickly learned to avoid them altogether. However, this didn't seem to faze them, and many of us recalled their polite but ominous refrain. Unfortunate, but you will soon see the truth. Those words echoed in my head when on a particularly dark February night the pyramid appeared at the end of the street. It was ethereal, an effervescent volume of red mist, and one by one we came out of our houses to gaze upon its impossible appearance until every house was empty, and the street was filled with silent awe. The pyramid pulled us toward itself, and like human ice breaking from a glacier, individually we went, freeing ourselves from the loving grips of our neighbors and families. I watched as Mr. Maxwell drifted toward the pyramid and disappeared into it. Then it took me, despite its tangible exterior dimensions. The pyramid was infinitely vast on the inside. Its crimson redness pulsed, and space itself hummed, and from the hum emanated the voice of Mr. Aberoa. Welcome, Norman. Tonight you shall know enlightenment. I fell, on impact. I arose and saw before me an axe and the kneeling, crying figure of Mr. Maxwell. Don't, he sobbed. Bloody spray adorned his face. Take the axe, instructed Mr. Aberoa. This is your destiny. I hesitated. Mr. Maxwell cried hysterically. His hands were bloody too. Understand, Norman. Everything up to now, it has been for you. All life has been for you. My heart pumped hotly. I picked up the axe. You are the one. And somewhere deep inside I knew he was right. I was special. Mr. Maxwell raised his eyes to look at me. I crushed his skull. His body crumpled. His blood painted my face, and I fell to my knees, tossing the axe aside. I had done it. Mr. Maxwell's body disappeared. Natalia landed in front of me. Our eyes met. Take the axe, Mr. Aberoa instructed her out of the hum. This is your destiny. All life has been for you. Don't, I sobbed. Even among my more troubled patients, Richter was unique. The level to which he was disturbed without any known cause or stimulus was unprecedented, and so I considered him my prized patient, the broken mine upon which I would sail to psychological stardom. This was even before I personally witnessed him bloom and unseed. The primary cause of Richter's psychosis was nightmares. He experienced them constantly, cyclically, and when they reached their inevitable crescendo, with such completeness that to describe them as his counter-reality would be an injustice to his terror. They were hyper-reality, more real than the everyday worldview or I. Each nightmare gripped him for weeks, first whenever he slept but soon creeping into his waking life, so that he had no respite. Indeed, the nightmares gained power over time, adapting to his emotions and evolving to maximize their own atrocity, until they attained peak horror and released him, never to return. Sometimes a few peaceful days would subsequently pass, but even those were stained with the dread of a new nightmare to come. However, it is this act of peaking, which I shall in my professional capacity call the bloom, and which I first witnessed 2 months ago, that has shaken me to the core, not only as a psychologist but as a human being. I witnessed the following through a secret window in a clinical room mocked up to resemble Richter's bedchamber. After suffering several hours of unrelenting mental anguish manifesting itself almost grotesquely in the physical realm as perspiration, tremors, self-mutilation and incomprehensible muttering, Richter falls suddenly to sleep. The slumber, which to my observations appears deep, lasts 2 hours and 34 minutes. It ends abruptly as Richter leaps to his feet, tears off his clothing, digs his nails into the top of his scalp, and proceeds, in much the same brutal manner, to tear the skin off his skull. His screams are unbearable, although it is unclear whether they are the result of mental pain or the physical pain of his auto-deskinning. Once his skull is exposed, he proceeds to tear the skin off his face, which, in the most unbelievable way, resembles less human bone and musculature than the petals of a bloody dandelion. No longer veiled by skin, this face flower achieves a gloriously yellow color and blooms before my eyes. One madness of flora and fauna, but swiftly, as the screams intensify, the flower begins to wilt, the hanging veils of skin climb his face, enclosing it, before bursting forth to reveal a spherical seed head. As a wind of screams rages within the chamber, breaking the blowball and dispersing its multitude of nightmare seeds, reality ripples. Finally the wind subsists, silence returns, and Richter stands, an immobile, headless body. The veils of skin form an orb above his neck. He falls, and when he awakens in the morning his head has been biologically recreated. His memories of the entire incident are faint, fading. The entire process leaves no visible scars and no physical evidence. Thus my hypothesis, Richter is not only man, but an organic manifestation of the nightmare impulse, a sentient host for a parasitic nightmare laboratory whose creations are perfected in his mind before being disseminated into humanity at large. The nightmares we experience, often dulled as if through a fog, Richter has already experienced countless times at an impossible clarity. Whether he is the only one of his kind I cannot say in the coming weeks. I must complete my written study and submit it for peer review. I predict it will revolutionize the field of psychology, the understanding of the mind, and introduce finally the notion of horror as a living entity, an incubus among us. It was Danvers who finally pushed him in. We'd been feeding the fire with hardwood since the afternoon, and it had gotten big as the wind picked up by nightfall, flickering across at our faces and warming our cheeks better than a gas heater. He didn't even scream when he fell. The flames just swallowed him up, sparks shooting out like hot vomit. He knew what he'd done. He knew it was wrong. When he lifted himself up and came out of the fire, he stood dead still, staring at us, smiling like we'd done him a favor. Maybe he thought he deserved to turn into ash. Maybe he did deserve it. I know I kept my fingers tight round the handle of the axe just the same till he keeled over, and Cooley had touched the corpse with his foot. And we knew he was dead, the three of us. We kept silent for a long while after that. There was just the sound of wood burning, and it was better that way. None of us touched the body, but none of us looked away, either. You could still make out his face, unmistakable. When the rest of him was dark and formless, he was a face on a pile. Then the wind started taking bits and pieces and carrying them away. Like I told the police, he didn't touch me, but I knew some of the kids he'd done it to. He'd done it to Danvers. I remember once when all the other kids were gone, I'd stayed after class. Mr. Gregor bent himself close to my ear and told me the real story. "You're a wicked one," he said when he was done, just like Don Whitman. They used to scare us with Don Whitman, the adults, the other teachers, our parents, the priest. But no one ever explained it. They'd just say, "You better do what we want or else Don Whitman will come back and get you." Mr. Gregor was the only one ever to tell it to me with details. He told it different, too. He said he remembered because he was the same age as Don Whitman and they went to the same school. He said that what the others say they remember is like Cain and Abel or Little Red Riding Hood. Even the landscape tells the fairy tale. After it happened, John Whitman's school got torn down, then his house. And the bells in the church got changed. The ones they rang after Elizabeth Cartwell had come back hysterical with the news. You can't tear down or change a man's memory, Mr. Gregor told me. Once you see, it's forever. Elizabeth Cartwell's parents moved away as soon as the police investigation finished. A lot of people moved away, but Mr. Gregor showed me a newspaper from Hill City, North Dakota from some years later. The paper was yellow, but you could read the black print fine. The story was about a girl who'd killed herself. The photo was of Elizabeth Cartwell, as he held it out for me to see. His hand shook, and I felt his breath grow warmer against the skin around my neck. Nothing made him shake as much as what happened to Elizabeth Cartwell, not even the details. John Whitman was 17 when he did it. He was handsome, with wide shoulders and played football. All the girls liked him. He was going to go to college. Maybe that's why they thought he was ready. They thought he was a man. They thought he'd be with them. It was a school night when they woke him and drove out to the old pumping station so that he could see everything for himself. They wanted to make him a part of it just like they were. If he saw, he would want it just like they did. I was always told that he drove out there by himself, but Mr. Gregor told me that's part of the lie. He said Don Whitman's father was in the car with the mayor and the chief of police. He said, how would he have found the place by himself? Why would he have gone looking? The place is in a wood not far from the border. Of course, the whole underground is filled with cement now, but you can still see where the opening used to be, a fat tube sticking out of the ground, just big enough for a man to crawl down into. There was a hatch on it then, and thick locks. The hatch was soundproof. If you stood right beside it, you couldn't hear a thing, but as soon as you opened the hatch you could smell the insides and hear the moans start to drift upwards into the world. A steel ladder led down. Mr. Gregor says they all knew about it. Everyone, all the adults. They'd all been down that ladder. All of them had seen it. John Whitman went down the ladder too. He must have smelled the insides grow stronger and heard the moaning echo louder with every rung. And he kept going. On the ground above, his father spoke to the mayor, and they both felt proud. John Whitman must have been more scared of coming up and disappointing them than of not going down to the limit. But when he reached the bottom, the very bottom, and put his feet to the hard concrete and saw it before his own eyes, something inside of him must have broken. They sugarcoat it, and they make a child's game of it because they're too scared to remember the truth. Mr. Gregor told me they can't forget it, but it's a stain to them, so they cover it up and pretend that everything's clean. John Whitman saw the vastness of the interlocking chambers and, within them, the writhing, ecstatic, swollen no people of the underground, human-like but non-human, crossbred mammals draped in plaster white skin pinned to numb faces, men, women and children, male and female, naked, scared, dirty, with humans Don Whitman knew and recognized among them, on them and under them, hitting them, squeezing them, making them hurt, making monstrous sounds with them, all under slowly rotating heat lamps, all open and together, one before another, and then someone Don Whitman knew, must have put a hand on Don Whitman's shoulder, and Don Whitman would have asked, "But what now? What am I supposed to do?" And then, from somewhere deep within the chambers, from a place not even Don Whitman would ever see, a voice answered, "Anything." Mr. Gregor pulled away from me, and I felt my body turn cold. Icy sweat crawled under my collar and below my thighs. I'd been told Don Whitman had found the old pumping station and lured the police to it, that they'd called the others including Don Whitman's father to talk him out of any violence, but that he'd snapped and murdered them all without firing a single shot, with his bare hands, and dumped the bodies into the metal pipe sticking out of the ground, the one just wide enough for a man to fit through. Then he disappeared. It wasn't until days later that Elizabeth Cartwell found the bodies, and there was never any sign of Don Whitman after that. The manhunt failed, so the church bells rang. The school was torn down. The pipe was filled in, and ever since, the adults scare their children with the story of the high school boy who'd done a terrible, sinful thing and vanished into thin air. And why would she decide to go out there? Mr. Gregor asked, meaning Elizabeth Cartwell, his eyes dead set through a window at the raining world outside. It's as transparent as a sheet of the Bible. Every word of it, they all pretend to believe because they've all made it up together. But the police reports, the testimony, the news stories, the court records, the verdict, a sham, a falsification made truth because 1,000 people and the judge repeat it, word for word, every night before bed. I tried to stand but couldn't. My heart was pounding me back into the chair. I was thinking about my mother and father. I had only enough courage for one question, so I asked, what happened to the no people? Mr. Gregor turned suddenly and laughed so fierce the rain lashed the windows even harder. He came toward me. He put a delicate hand on each of my shoulders. He bent forward until his lips were almost touching mine and, his eyes staring at me like one stares at the devil, said, "Buried in the concrete. Buried alive. Buried dead." I pushed him away. He stumbled backward without losing his balance. I forced myself off the chair, praying that my legs would keep. My knees shook but held. In front of me, Mr. Gregor rasped for air. A few long strands of his thin hair had fallen across his forehead. He was sweating. He was a coward, that little boy Don Whitman. Without him, we wouldn't need to live under the whip of elaborate lies designed by weaker people turned away and shamed by the power of the natural order of things. They trusted him, and he betrayed us all. The fools, the weakling. Imagine, Mr. Gregor hissed. Just imagine what we could have had, what we could have experienced down there, at the very bottom, in the chambers. Double quotes. His eyes spun and his chest heaved as he grew excited, but soon he lost his venom and his voice returned to normal. Finally, he said without any nastiness, "You're a wicked one, just like John Whitman," and I ran out. Danvers prodded me awake. I must have fallen asleep during the night because when I opened my eyes it was morning already. The sun was up and the flames gone, but the fire was still warm. Mr. Gregor's dead face still rested atop a pile of ashes. Corley was asleep on the dirt across from us. I could tell Danvers hadn't slept at all. He said he'd been to a farmhouse and called the police. We woke up, Corley, and talked over what we'd say when they got here. We decided on something close to the truth. Mr. Gregor had taken the three of us camping and, when he tried to do a bad thing, we put up a fight and knocked him into the flames. Corley said it might be suspicious because of how easily Mr. Gregor had burned, but Danvers said that some people were like that, they burned quick and whole, so we needn't say a word about the gasoline. When the police came, they were professional and treated us fair, but when they took me aside to talk to me about the accident, every time I tried to tell them about the bad things Mr. Gregor had done, they wouldn't hear it. They just said it was a shame there'd been an accident and someone had died at home. I asked my parents whether Mr. Gregor was a bad person for what he'd done to Danvers and others. My mother didn't say anything. My father looked at me like he was looking at the devil himself and said morality was not so simple and that people had differing points of view and that, in the end, much depended not on what you did, but who you did it to, like during the war. For example, there were some who deserved to be done to and others whose privilege it was to do. Then he picked up his magazine and told me it was best not to think about such things at all. I did keep thinking about them, and about John Whitman, too. When I got to high school, I was too old to scare with monsters, but once in a while I'd hear one of the adults tell a kid he better do as he'd been told, or Don Whitman would come back and get him. I wondered if maybe people scare others with monsters they were most scared of themselves. I even thought about investigating, taking a pickaxe to the pumping station and cracking through concrete, or investigating records of how much of it had been poured in there. But I figured the records could have been fixed and one person with a pickaxe wouldn't get far before the police came, and I didn't trust them anymore. I also had homework to worry about, and I started seeing a girl. I'd almost forgotten about Don Whitman by the time my mother sent me out one evening with my dad's rifle to hunt down a coyote she said had been attacking her hens. I took a bike, because it was quiet, and was roaming just beyond town when I saw something kick up dust in a field. I shot at it, missed, and it scurried off. I pedaled after it until it seemingly disappeared into nowhere. I kept my eye firm on the spot I saw it last, and when I got close enough, I saw there was a small hole in the ground there. I stuck the rifle in and the hole felt bigger on the inside, so I stomped all around till the hole caved, and where there'd been a mouse-sized hole now there was an opening a grown man could fit through. It seemed deep, which made me curious, because there aren't many caves around here, so I stuck my feet in but still couldn't feel the bottom. I slid in a little further, and further still, and soon the opening was above my head and I was inside with my whole body. It was dark but I could feel the ground sloping. I'm eyes accustomed to the gloom. I saw enough to tell there was a tunnel leading into the depths, and that it was big enough for me to crawl through. I didn't have a light but I knew it was important to try the hole. Maybe there were no people at the bottom, mostly though. I didn't think I expected that every time I poked ahead with the rifle, I'd hit earth and the tunnel would be done. That never happened. I descended for hours. The tunnel grew narrower and the slope sharpened. Fear tightened around my chest. I lost track of time. There wasn't enough space to turn my body around, and I'd been descending for so long it was foolish to backtrack. Surely, the tunnel led somewhere. It was not a natural tunnel. I told myself, it must lead somewhere. I should continue until I reached the end, turn around, and return to the surface. The trick was to keep calm and keep moving forward, and I was right. Several hours later the tunnel ended, and I crawled out through a hollow in the wall of a huge grotto. I stood, stretched my limbs and squinted through the dimness. I couldn't see the other end of the grotto, but the wall curved, so I thought that maybe if I went along I might get to the other end. My plan of an immediate return to the surface was on hold. I had to see what lived here. Images of no people raced through my head. I readied my rifle and proceeded, slowly at first. Where the tunnel had been packed dirt and clay, the walls and floor of the grotto, a solid rock. There was moisture, too. It flowed down the walls and gathered in depressions on the floor. Although at first the wall felt smooth, soon I began to feel a texture to it like a washboard. The ceiling faded into view, the grotto was getting smaller, and the texture was becoming rougher, more violent. I was thinking about the texture and Mr. Gregor's burnt body when a sound sent me sprawling. My elbow banged against the rock, and I nearly cried out. My heart was beating like it had beaten me into my chair in the classroom. The sound was real, faint but clear and echoing. It was the sound of continuous and rhythmic scratching. I crawled forward, holding the rifle in front. The scratching grew louder. I thought about calling out, but suddenly felt foolish to believe in no people or anything of that kind. It seemed more sensible to believe in large rodents or coyotes with sharp teeth. I could have turned back, but the only thing more frightening than a monster in front is a monster behind, so I pulled myself on. In fact, I was crawling up a small hill and, when I had reached the top, I looked down and there it was. His was a human body, though hunched. He stood on human legs and scratched with human hands. His movements were also clearly a man's movements. There was nothing feminine about them. His half-translucent skin was grey, almost white, and taut, and if he had any hair, I didn't see it. His naked body was completely smooth. I looked at him for a long time with dread and disgust. His arms didn't stop moving. Whatever they were scratching, they kept scratching. Even when he turned and his head looked at me, even as I, stunned frozen in terror, recoiled against the wall, still his arms kept moving and his hands clawing. For a few seconds, I thought he'd seen me, that I was done for. I gripped the rifle tight, but as I focused on his face, I realized he hadn't seen me at all. He couldn't see me. His face, so much like a colorless swollen skull, was punctuated by two black and empty eye sockets. He turned back to face the wall he was scratching. I turned my face, too. The texture on the wall was his. The deeper the grooves, the newer the work. I put down the rifle and put my hand on the wall, letting my fingers trace the contours of the texture. It wasn't simple lines. The scratching wasn't meaningless. These were two words repeated over and over, sometimes on top of each other, sometimes backwards, sometimes small, sometimes each letter as big as a person, and they were all around this vast underground lair. Everywhere you looked, two words, Don Whitman. He'd made this grotto. I felt feverish, the sheer greatness, the determination needed to scratch out such a place with one's bare hands, or perhaps the insanity, the punishment. If I hadn't been sitting, a wave of empathy would have knocked me to the wet, rocky floor. I picked up the rifle. I could put Don Whitman out of his misery. I lifted the rifle and pointed it at the distant figure writing his name pointlessly into the wall. With one pull of the trigger, I could show him infinite mercy. I steadied myself. I said a prayer. Don Whitman stopped scratching and wailed. I bit down on my teeth. I hadn't fired yet. He grabbed his head and fell to his knees. The high-pitched sound coming from his throat was unbearable. I felt like my mind was being ripped apart. I dropped the rifle and covered my ears again. Don Whitman turned, this time with his entire body. He crawled a few steps toward me, still wailing, before stopping and falling silent. He raised his head. Where before had been just eye sockets, now there were eyes. White, with irises. Somehow, they'd grown. He got to his feet and I was sure that he could see me now. He was staring at me. I called his name, Don Whitman. He didn't react. Thoughts raced through my mind. What should I do once he comes toward me? Should I defend myself or should I embrace him? But he didn't step forward. He took one step back and lifted his long fingers to his face. His nails, I now saw, were thick and curved as a bird's talons. He moved them softly from his forehead, down his cheeks and up to his eyes, into which, without warning, he pressed them so painfully that I felt my own eyes burn. When he brought his fingers back out, in each hand he held a mashed and bleeding eyeball. These he put almost greedily into his mouth, one after the other, and chewed and swallowed. Having nourished his body, he returned to the wall and began scratching again. As I watched the movements of his arms, able to follow the pattern of the letters they were carving, I no longer felt like killing him. If he wanted to die, he could die. He could forego water. He could refuse to eat. He didn't want to die. He wanted to keep scratching his name into the walls of this grotto. Don Whitman, Don Whitman, Don Whitman. I watched him for a long time before I realized that I would have to get to the surface soon. People would begin to worrying. They might start looking for me. And as much as I needed to know the logic behind Don Whitman's grotto, I also needed food. I couldn't live down here. I couldn't eat my own eyes and expect them to grow back. Eventually, I would either have to return to the world above or die. I put my hand on the grotto wall and began to mentally retrace my steps. A return would not be difficult. All I would need to do was follow. That's when I knew the geography of it hit me. The hole I'd entered was on the outskirts of town. The tunnel sloped toward the town. That meant this grotto was below the town. The town hall, the bank, the police station, the school, all of it was lying unknowingly on top of a giant expanding cavity. One day, this cavity would be too large, the town would be too heavy, and everything would collapse into a deep and permanent handmade abyss. Don Whitman would bury the town just as the town had buried the no people. Everything would be destroyed. Everyone would die. That was Don Whitman's genius. That was his life's work. I picked up the rifle and faced Don Whitman for the final time. He must have known that I was there. He'd heard me, and had probably seen me before he pulled out his eyes. Yet he just continued to scratch. Faced with death, he kept working. As I stood there, I had no doubt that, left in peace, Don Whitman would finish his project. His will was too powerful. The result would be catastrophic. It was under these assumptions that I made the most moral and important decision of my life. I walked away. When are you going to leave your wife? My mistress asked. I was putting on my boots. Soon, I said. On my way home, I swung by the office to pick up a new golf club I'd had delivered, then stopped by the daycare to pick up my son. That's when I saw the first wasp. I assumed it had entered the car on my son's clothes. It was particularly pesky, eluding my attempts to flush it out the windows until I had no choice but to pull over and hunt it down with a rolled-up business magazine, a hunt that ended with a very satisfying splat. The next one appeared a few days later while I was pretending to watch TV, followed by a second and third, and all three buzzed so loudly I couldn't concentrate on my sexting. I had to take a break and kill them. Splat. Dozens more materialized the following week. By now, I was certain we had an infestation, but my wife insisted she hadn't seen any, and my son was too young to talk. I called an exterminator. House is clean, he said after his inspection. But it wasn't. The wasps continued to show up, day after day, in ever greater numbers. Anytime I was home, they buzzed relentlessly. I stopped being able to sleep. I stopped being able to concentrate. The only time I felt any peace from them was at work, where my boss increasingly micromanaged me, and in the hotel, where my mistress had stepped up her nagging. It's been almost a year. Are you gonna leave your wife or not? One day, I could barely take it anymore, and had to use every ounce of my self-control not to slap her across the face. When my son is a little older, I said through clenched teeth, on my wife's birthday, my wife and I took turns hiding from our son in a game of hide and seek. I hid in our shed. It was dark inside, and when the buzzing started I suddenly felt the wasps all around me, crawling on my face and limbs. And as I lurched for the exit I felt as if I were passing through an entire atmosphere of them. I imagined them flying down my throat, devouring my eyes, numbing my tongue. I screamed and my wife had to calm me down. It's okay. There aren't any more wasps, she repeated as she petted my hair like I was a dumb dog. I took a sabbatical from work because I was home all day. We cancelled daycare. I checked the house insistently for the wasp lair. I knew there was one because I had already killed thousands. That's when I saw it, my son sleeping so peacefully as a wasp exited his nostril. Another emerged from his ear. I knew what had to be done, what I had to do. Wasps buzzed. Phone buzzed. I grabbed my golf club. Splat. The 16th century turned. I lived with my father, a nobleman without acumen who had lent money he lacked means to collect or re-earn, and his sickly wife, for whom he had left my mother. I had 3 siblings, brothers all dead, by illness, murder, suicide. Given my father's circumstance, he hungered to marry me to a wealthy suitor, and likely would have done so if not for the letter, which arrived on a particularly cold October night, and which my father read with such rapt attention it bordered on candlelit glee, before instructing me, having communicated no details, that I would forthwith be dispatched to the castle of CG in Upper Hungary to live with my cousin Elizabeth. The trip was dismal, but I shall never forget my first impression of the castle. A magnificent hilltop silhouette boldly opaque against the crimson of a setting sun. I met Elizabeth the following morning, and it was as if she were a magic mirror, for we were of identical height, build and pale complexion. We became natural friends and she shared everything with me, food, garments, jewelry. In exchange, my duties consisted of 1. To dress finely and visit the nearby towns in search of women to enlist in Elizabeth's employ and entourage. Young and unblemished, she said. I lived in a dream. It was not until months later, after I had procured many women for Elizabeth, that my suspicions began. Despite my memory for faces, I would often fail to meet those I had previously engaged. They came to Castle of CG and vanished. My conscience gnawed at my dreams. One evening, I decided to follow one of the new women to satisfy my curiosity and return peace to my soul. Yet, what I discovered was the very crux of dread. Deep within the castle grounds there existed a tangle of hallways leading to 5 uneven chambers, and within one of these, waxen female bodies hanging by chains fastened around ankles, throats open over faces painted in dry blood, some still slowly dripping into a long trough, through which their virgin blood flowed into an adjacent room, in which, amidst the persistent buzzing of flies, a solitary metal tub filled with scarlet, stillness and tranquility its surface broken, by the emergence of Elizabeth's face. I ran, through twisted hallways out under the amber-like night, through the grounds to the gate and beyond, over soft mounds through which despite my screams I heard the buried victims crying for impossible salvation. Beating hooves, thunder in the back of my pulsing head. I regained consciousness surrounded by warmth, but my comfort soured, for I realized I was in the blood tub, held there by the arms of servants who smiled and called me by her villainous name, Elizabeth. The investigators arrived, the description fit, as did the clothes, and the eyewitnesses agreed I was the one who had come for their daughters. In defense, I had but truth, a lifetime imprisonment of truth. 1968, Vietnam, thump thump thump. To Huey passed over dark jungle and like an oversized dragonfly, as we sat clutching our rifles, listening to the deafening whir of the blades, not saying a goddamn word. There were 3 of us, me, Ricky, and the captain plus the pilot. But the captain wasn't a real captain, no, sir. He had civilian written all over him in ballpoint legalese. Then again, this wasn't a real mission, and all of us knew it. Something lit up below.